At 2:49 p.m., the first blast tears through the finish line crowd. 13 seconds later, a second explosion hits, close enough that people feel it in their teeth. For a moment, Boston doesn't scream, it freezes. Then the street fills with smoke, alarms, and the kind of silence that only exists right before panic takes over. But here's what most people never think about. The suspects didn't vanish into thin air. They walked away, blending into a city that had just become a crime scene. And for the next 4 days, investigators would build the case in reverse, one frame of video at a time, until the hunt exploded into a night that ended with a firefight, a lockdown, and a hidden figure discovered when Boston thought the worst was already over. The marathon had been a celebration, people cheering, families filming, volunteers handing out water. Then the blasts hit. First responders ran toward the chaos. Hospitals went into surge mode. Dispatch radios stacked with overlapping calls. And while the city fought to keep people alive, another battle began quietly in the background. Find out who did this. Fast. Because the most dangerous moment in an attack isn't the explosion. It's the hours after, when investigators don't know if there's another device, another team, another target. In the first hours, authorities did what they always do in a modern city after a major attack. They treated the entire area like a giant digital footprint. Security cameras from businesses, intersections, and buildings. Phones and photos from spectators, thousands of people were recording that day. Surveillance video from nearby routes leading away from the scene. Investigators weren't just hunting a face. They were hunting a pattern: who arrived, who lingered, who left at the exact wrong moment. This is where the story becomes terrifyingly simple. Sometimes a case isn't cracked by a confession. It's cracked by a single ordinary camera that never blinked. 3 days after the bombing, authorities made a move that can't be taken back. On the evening of Thursday, April 18th, the FBI publicly released photographs of 2 suspects and warned the public not to approach them, armed and extremely dangerous. That release did 2 things at once. It focused the entire investigation onto 2 moving targets. It turned the entire public into a living sensor network, because tips poured in immediately. And that same night, the case jumped from investigation to manhunt. After the photos went public, events accelerated rapidly. Later that night, MIT police officer Sean Collier was shot and killed while sitting in his patrol vehicle. Then came the moment that would connect the dots in real time. A Mercedes SUV was carjacked in Boston, and the owner was held captive. He later escaped and called 911. During the response, investigators learned the victim overheard the carjackers saying they were connected to the marathon bombings, and discussing going to another major city. That single detail flipped the switch. This wasn't just about identifying suspects anymore. This was about stopping the next attack. And that's because once that call came in, the hunt stopped being a search and became a race. At 5 p.m., the FBI did something investigators hesitate to do unless they're running out of time. They released the faces. 2 young men. Baseball caps. Backpacks. And in seconds, an entire nation leaned closer to their screens, because someone, somewhere had already seen them. For 3 days after the bombing, investigators worked in silence. No leaks. No suspects named. No arrests announced. Behind closed doors, analysts were drowning in data. Thousands of hours of surveillance footage. Cell phone videos from spectators. Photos pulled from social media. The problem wasn't a lack of evidence. It was too much evidence. So authorities made a calculated, high-risk move. They went public. The photos weren't dramatic. No weapons. No masks. No obvious panic. That's what made them terrifying. 2 men walking calmly away from the finish line, seconds after the explosions, carrying backpacks similar to the ones later found at the blast sites. This wasn't a wanted poster. It was a timeline frozen into a frame. Investigators weren't saying, "This is who did it." They were saying, "Help us understand who these men are." The moment the images hit the news, phones buzzed. Social feeds exploded. Tips flooded in by the thousands. People replayed their own footage. Zoomed into photos. Rechecked videos they'd forgotten they even recorded. For the first time, the hunt wasn't confined to a task force. It was everywhere. But releasing suspect images cuts both ways. False accusations surge. Innocent people get named. Online speculation becomes reckless. Investigators knew this risk. But they also knew something else. These men were still free. They were watching the same press conference. And that meant the clock had officially started. Somewhere in the Boston area, 2 brothers saw their own faces on national television. They knew something the public didn't yet. The window was closing. What happened next wasn't random. It wasn't panic. It was movement. Because once suspects know they've been identified, there are only two options: disappear or act. They chose to act. Less than 3 hours after the images went public, the investigation crossed a line it could never uncross. A police officer was shot and killed in his patrol car on a quiet campus. No warning. No chase. Just sudden violence. To authorities, this wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. The suspects weren't just identified. They were escalating. Up until now, the Boston bombing was a forensic investigation. After this moment, it became a live manhunt. Every decision from here on out would happen under pressure. In real time. With lives at stake. And with suspects who now knew they were being hunted. And the next break in the case wouldn't come from a lab. It would come from a terrified civilian trapped inside a stolen car, listening to a conversation he was never supposed to hear. Welcome to Coziness Stories. If you enjoy calm, immersive stories like this, take a moment to subscribe and make yourself at home. Inside a stolen Mercedes, a terrified man listened as two brothers calmly discussed the Boston Marathon bombing, and casually mentioned they were planning another attack. He had one chance to escape, and one phone call to make. Just hours after the FBI released the suspect photos, chaos struck again. On the campus of MIT, a police officer sat alone in his patrol car. Routine shift, quiet street. Then, gunfire. Officer Sean Collier was shot and killed without warning. No robbery. No argument. Just execution. Investigators immediately connected the dots. The suspects had seen the photos. And they were responding. Minutes later, in nearby Cambridge, a black Mercedes SUV stopped at a gas station. Inside was a man just trying to get home. He never saw them approach. A knock on the window. A gun pointed at his head. A command that left no room for negotiation. Get out. The brothers took the car, and the driver. What they didn't realize was that this man would become the most important witness of the entire case. As the vehicle moved, the driver sat frozen in the passenger seat. Then the conversation started. Not whispers. Not coded language. Casual. Come. They talked about the marathon bombing. How easy it was. How the pressure cooker bombs were made. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Did you see the news? That's us. The driver realized the truth in real time. He wasn't just kidnapped. He was riding with the most wanted men in America. Here's the chilling part. They didn't kill him. They talked. They bragged. They explained. Because they believed two things. They were smarter than everyone else. They were running out of time anyway. They even told him their next destination. New York. At a gas station stop, the driver saw his opening. The older brother stepped out. The younger followed. For a split second, the car was unattended. The driver bolted. Barefoot. Bleeding. Sprinting into a nearby convenience store. He grabbed the phone behind the counter and said the words police would never forget. I was carjacked, and they told me they bombed the marathon. Within minutes, cell phone data from the stolen car was activated. Patrol units flooded Cambridge. State police mobilized. Federal agents joined the pursuit. This was no longer a search. It was a race. Because the brothers were armed, desperate, and heading toward another major city. Before this call, authorities had suspects, evidence, faces. After this call, they had names, intent, a live trajectory. Jakar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev were no longer shadows and photos. They were moving targets. And they were about to turn a quiet Boston suburb into a war zone. What happened next unfolded in less than 90 seconds. Grenades thrown in the street. Hundreds of shots fired. And a brother left bleeding on the pavement. One suspect would die that night. The other would vanish. At 12:48 a.m., the first grenade exploded in a quiet residential street. By 12:49, police were under heavy fire. By 12:50, the city of Boston would begin shutting itself down. This wasn't a chase anymore. It was a war, unfolding in the dark. The stolen Mercedes had been tracked to Watertown, Massachusetts. Sirens echoed through narrow streets. Police cruisers boxed in intersections. Officers expected a tense arrest. They didn't expect explosives. The brothers didn't run. They fought. As police closed in, Tamerlan Tsarnaev stepped out of the vehicle. He didn't raise his hands. He opened fire. Gunshots cracked through the neighborhood, shattering windows and sending residents diving for cover. Then something worse hit the pavement. A homemade explosive. Officers later described it as surreal. Pipe bombs. Pressure cooker devices. Explosives tossed like grenades. Police returned fire as sparks lit the night sky. Residents watched from darkened windows as their street turned into a combat zone. This wasn't a standoff. It was an active battlefield. During the exchange, Tamerlan charged officers. He was hit multiple times. But he kept moving. Only when an officer tackled him did the fight end, briefly. Tamerlan lay wounded on the street. Handcuffed. Alive. But the danger wasn't over. As officers focused on Tamerlan, they heard an engine roar. Tsarnaev, the younger brother, was back in the SUV. He didn't turn around. He accelerated straight toward the officers. Toward his brother. Toward the chaos. The vehicle slammed forward. Tires screeched. And in a moment that stunned everyone, Jakar ran over his own brother. The SUV tore through the police line and disappeared into the night. Tamerlan Tsarnaev was rushed to the hospital. He would not survive. In under 10 minutes, a neighborhood was destroyed. Dozens of officers were injured. One suspect was dead. One had vanished. Police realized the most dangerous part wasn't over. It was just beginning. Before dawn, a historic decision was made. Public transit stopped. Schools closed. Businesses shut their doors. Boston went silent. A city of millions was ordered to stay inside. Because somewhere in the suburbs, a 19-year-old suspect was bleeding, armed, and desperate. This was the first time an American city had effectively shut itself down to capture a single suspect. And it worked. But not before fear reached every household. Not before uncertainty took over. And not before the final hiding place turned the manhunt into something no one expected. The next morning, police searched door to door, house by house, until one homeowner stepped outside and noticed something strange in his backyard. If this story is drawing you in, subscribing to Coziness Stories helps you enjoy more tales like this every time you return. The city was silent. No traffic. No voices. No movement. Then one man stepped into his backyard and noticed blood on his boat. Boston had never seen anything like this. Public transit frozen. Streets empty. Millions of people locked indoors. Helicopters hovered non-stop overhead while armored vehicles rolled through quiet neighborhoods. Police searched house by house, yard by yard. Nothing. No suspect. No movement. No mistake. Until the lockdown lifted. That afternoon, a Watertown resident finally stepped outside. His boat sat on a trailer behind the house, exactly where he'd left it. Except now something was wrong. The cover was disturbed. And there were dark stains seeping through the fabric. Blood. Police swarmed the backyard within minutes. Thermal imaging picked up heat inside the boat. Officers surrounded it, weapons raised. They knew one thing. Jakar Tsarnaev was inside. Wounded. Exhausted. And cornered. 4 hours, police called out commands. No response. Suddenly, movement. Gunshots rang out. Authorities returned fire. Tear gas filled the air. The boat rocked. Then silence. When officers finally pulled back the tarp, they found him alive. Barely conscious. Soaked in blood. Too weak to stand. The most intense manhunt in modern U.S. history ended not in a dramatic chase, but in a backyard. What investigators discovered next stunned even seasoned agents. Written on the inside walls of the boat, in blood and dirt, were messages. Words scrawled by a man who believed he was about to die. Statements about America. About war. About justification. Not madness. Belief. This wasn't just evidence. It was motive. It showed intent, ideology, and planning, written by the suspect himself. No interrogation could have revealed it better. That evening, officials stepped in front of cameras. Tonight, the suspect is in custody. Cheers erupted across Boston. People poured into the streets. Strangers hugged. But beneath the relief was a hard truth. The capture didn't answer the biggest question. How did two brothers, raised in America, become capable of this? That question would define everything that followed. The trial. The punishment. And the legacy of the Boston Marathon bombing. As Jakar Tsarnaev was wheeled into a hospital, investigators began digging into his past. And what they found challenged every assumption about who he really was. They weren't born enemies of America. They weren't raised in training camps. They weren't even on law enforcement radars. So how did two brothers, one a college student, end up changing U.S. history forever? Long before April 2013, the Tsarnaev brothers were mostly invisible. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother, was intense and restless. A failed boxer. A man searching for purpose. Jakar, younger by 7 years, blended in easily. Popular. Soft-spoken. A student who looked like thousands of others on American campuses. To neighbors, teachers, and classmates, nothing about them screamed threat. That's what made what came next so unsettling. Investigators would later focus on Tamerlan. He was the turning point. After his boxing dreams collapsed, something shifted. He withdrew. He grew angrier. He began consuming extremist content online. Friends noticed changes. Conversations turned rigid. Opinions hardened. Arguments escalated. He wasn't recruiting. He was radicalizing himself. Years before the bombing, a foreign intelligence agency had flagged Tamerlan. The warning reached U.S. authorities. An assessment was made. And then, nothing. No follow-up. No monitoring. No intervention. At the time there was no crime. Only belief. Dzhokhar looked up to Tamerlan. Not as a follower of ideology, but as a brother. That mattered. When belief comes wrapped in family loyalty, it doesn't arrive as propaganda. It arrives as trust. Investigators later concluded. Tamerlan led. Dzhokhar followed. Not blindly but willingly. The brothers didn't start with violence. They started with videos, forums, conversations late at night. Then came experimentation. Fireworks dismantled for powder. Instructions downloaded and tested. Pressure cookers bought quietly. No network. No handlers. No foreign funding. Just two men escalating together. Because it shattered assumptions. There was no cell. No overseas command. No warning signs that fit the old model. This was domestic radicalization, self-directed and invisible. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. By early 2013, the line had been crossed. This wasn't ideology anymore. It was commitment. The brothers chose a date, a location, a crowd. And once that decision was made, there was no turning back. Was this preventable? Or was this the kind of transformation no system is built to stop? That question would echo through courtrooms, intelligence agencies, and public debate for years. The bombs weren't the end of the story. They were the beginning of a legal battle that would force America to decide. Punishment or precedent. The courtroom wasn't arguing whether Tsarnaev did it. That part was settled. What America had to decide next was far harder. Should a 19-year-old face death for following his brother into terror? When the trial began, the defense made a stunning choice. They didn't deny responsibility. They admitted Tsarnaev's role in the bombing. Instead, they shifted the focus to one question. Who was really in control? This wasn't about innocence. It was about influence. Federal prosecutors laid out a clear narrative. Surveillance footage. Bomb fragments. Digital records. The carjacking testimony. The messages written inside the boat. They argued this wasn't coercion. It was commitment. They reminded the jury. Children were among the victims. Lives were permanently destroyed. The attack was deliberate and calculated. Their conclusion was blunt. This was terrorism, and terrorism demands the harshest punishment. The defense didn't excuse the crime. They contextualized it. They painted Dzhokhar as immature, easily influenced, living in the shadow of a dominant older brother. They replayed the family dynamic, the radicalization timeline. The moment Dzhokhar stopped thinking for himself, their argument wasn't sympathy. It was mitigation. The trial captivated the country. Because this wasn't just about one defendant. It raised questions Americans weren't comfortable answering. Does age matter in terrorism? Can influence reduce culpability? Should ideology override circumstance? Every testimony reopened wounds. Every photograph reminded the jury and the public what had been lost. Survivors took the stand. Parents spoke of children they'd never hold again. Runners described legs that would never move the same. These weren't political statements. They were consequences, and they weighed heavily on the room. Boston is a city historically opposed to capital punishment. Yet this case forced a national reckoning. The prosecution demanded death. The defense begged for life without parole. There was no middle ground. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its decision. Tsarnaev was found guilty on all counts. The next phase, sentencing, would determine whether he lived or died. The courtroom held its breath. This wasn't just a verdict. It was a referendum on how America responds to homegrown terror. And whatever the jury decided next would ripple far beyond this case. The jury had to choose. Death, or life in a concrete cell until the end of time. And when the sentence was announced, it shocked the world. The jury spoke 4 words that echoed across the country: sentence of death. But for this case, the verdict wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a legal battle that would last more than a decade. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev stood expressionless as the decision was read. Death by lethal injection. Some victims cried in relief. Others stared ahead numb. Outside the courthouse, reactions split instantly. Justice served. Justice questioned. Justice debated. The nation didn't agree, but the sentence stood. For now. Capital punishment cases don't end at sentencing. They multiply. Every appeal becomes a battlefield. Jury selection. Media exposure. Venue bias. Mental state. Influence of the older brother. Tsarnaev's legal team immediately filed motions. They weren't trying to retry the bombing. They were trying to retry the process. The defense focused on one key claim. The jury was never allowed to hear the full extent of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's violent past. They argued. The older brother's role was minimized. Dzhokhar was portrayed as equally culpable. Crucial context was excluded. If jurors had known more, the defense claimed the sentence could have been different. In a stunning move, a federal appeals court vacated the death sentence. Not because Dzhokhar was innocent, but because of procedural concerns. The ruling sent shockwaves through the country. Families were forced to relive the trauma. Supporters of the death penalty were outraged. Opponents saw it as overdue correction. The question returned, louder than ever. Should this man die for what he did? The U.S. Supreme Court took the case. And when it ruled, it didn't hesitate. The death sentence was reinstated. The court concluded. The trial was fair. The jury was impartial. The sentence was lawful. For the highest court in the land, the debate was over. Even after the Supreme Court decision, the story refused to settle. Because something bigger had emerged. Not about guilt, but about how terrorism cases should be handled in the future. The Tsarnaev case became precedent. A blueprint. A warning. Today, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev sits on federal death row. Isolated. Restricted. Waiting. No execution date set. No public voice. Just time. For victims' families, there is no closure. For the public, there is no consensus. And for the justice system, the case remains a reference point, cited, debated, studied. Because this wasn't just a bombing case. It was a test of how a nation responds when terror comes from within. But one question still lingers, quietly, persistently. What lessons did authorities learn, and what mistakes can never be undone? Stories feel better when shared. Subscribe to Coziness Stories and join a space made for quiet moments and deep stories. Years before the bombs exploded, a warning crossed international lines. A name was flagged. A concern was logged. And then, nothing happened. Could the Boston Marathon bombing have been stopped? Before April 2013, Tamerlan Tsarnaev wasn't invisible. A foreign intelligence agency had raised concerns about him years earlier, warning U.S. authorities that he was becoming radicalized. The information reached federal hands. An assessment was conducted. And then the trail went cold. At the time there was no crime. No arrest. No clear violation. Just suspicion. From a law enforcement perspective, the decision made sense. On paper. Tamerlan had no criminal convictions tied to terrorism. Was a legal resident. Was protected by constitutional limits. Belief alone wasn't enough. And acting without cause could have meant violating civil liberties. So the file was closed. The Boston case exposed something deeply unsettling. Modern terror threats don't always come from organized cells. They come from online spaces, self-radicalization, personal grievances, no handler, no overseas funding, no clear trail, just ideology meeting opportunity. That's the kind of threat systems are worst at detecting. Even if authorities had continued monitoring Tamerlan, there's a haunting reality. Dzhokhar wasn't on anyone's radar. He was younger, quieter, more adaptable. The system watched individuals. The danger came from relationships. After the attack, agencies conducted internal reviews. No single mistake caused the bombing. But a pattern emerged. Missed signals. Fragmented information. No unified response to ideological escalation. Each failure alone was survivable. Together they were catastrophic. As these details became public, outrage followed. Families of victims demanded answers. Politicians demanded reform. Citizens asked the question no one wanted to face. How many other warnings are being ignored right now? There is no system that can stop every attack. No database that predicts belief. No algorithm that reads intent before it becomes action. The Boston Marathon bombing wasn't just an intelligence failure. It was a human one. Because prevention isn't about perfection. It's about improvement. And every lesson learned from this case has shaped how authorities monitor, assess, and intervene today. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes controversially. But the final legacy of this case isn't found in court rulings or policy changes. It's found in how America remembers, and what it chooses never to forget. You're listening to Coziness Stories. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story waiting for you. After the sirens faded, after the suspect was captured, after the trial ended, America was not the same country it had been before the bombs went off. In the months after the Boston Marathon bombing, public events across the U.S. quietly transformed. Concrete barriers appeared where there had once been open sidewalks. Bag checks became routine. Police presence multiplied. Marathons, parades, concerts, every gathering was now planned with Boston in mind. Not out of fear. Out of memory. Boston didn't invent the slogan. But it gave it urgency. The bombing showed how ordinary objects, backpacks, cookware, everyday items, could become weapons. Law enforcement shifted focus. More public awareness campaigns. Faster tip processing. Stronger coordination between agencies. The public wasn't just watching anymore. They were participating. The citywide lockdown, once controversial, became a case study. Police academies analyzed it. Emergency planners debated it. Governments asked the hard question. Was shutting down an entire city justified? Boston answered, yes. Not because it was easy. Because it worked. For survivors, legacy meant something else. Amputations. Trauma. Lives permanently altered. Many became advocates. Some disappeared from public view. Others returned to the marathon, defiant, determined. They weren't symbols. They were proof that terror didn't win. The year after the bombing, the marathon ran again. Stronger security. Heavier presence. Unbreakable resolve. Runners crossed the finish line carrying names of victims. Crowds cheered louder than ever. Boston wasn't just honoring the past. It was reclaiming it. Boston Strong. Not a slogan invented by marketers. A reaction. A refusal. It became shorthand for resilience, used in tragedies that followed, long after the city healed. The Boston Marathon bombing became more than a crime. It became a benchmark for terrorism response, a study in radicalization, a warning about overlooked signals, a lesson in collective resilience. Its influence reaches far beyond 2013. But even with all the lessons learned, there's one final question this case leaves behind, a question that doesn't have an easy answer. There were no warning sirens, no last-minute intelligence save, no intercepted plan. And that's why the most terrifying question still hangs in the air. Could this happen again right now? The Boston bombing didn't come from a foreign cell storming the border. It came from inside. From online spaces. From personal grievances. From belief hardened into violence. That's what makes prevention so difficult. Because modern terror doesn't always look like terror, until it does. Since 2013, intelligence agencies have rewritten playbooks. Not publicly. Quietly. They began watching patterns instead of profiles. Sudden ideological shifts. Online isolation spirals. Behavioral escalation. But even now, officials admit something uncomfortable. You can't arrest belief. Technology helps, and hurts. It flags keywords, tracks connections, surfaces patterns. But it also accelerates radicalization faster than any system can react. Algorithms don't ask why. They just feed what's consumed. Every preventive measure raises a dangerous tension. Security versus freedom. Boston showed what happens when action comes too late. History shows what happens when action comes too early. There is no perfect balance, only trade-offs. The Tsarnaev brothers didn't need instructions. They needed inspiration. That's the hardest threat to stop. No funding trail. No handlers. No communication to intercept. Just intent. Many survivors reject the question entirely. For them, fear isn't hypothetical. It already happened. Their focus is simpler. Healing. Accountability. Ensuring the story is told accurately. So the lesson doesn't fade. The Boston Marathon bombing wasn't a failure of courage. It was a reminder of limitation. No nation can promise perfect safety. But it can promise memory. And vigilance. Because every public event now carries Boston's shadow. Every unattended bag. Every suspicious pause. Every quiet instinct to look twice. That awareness isn't paranoia. It's legacy. And that leaves one last chapter. Not about bombs. Not about suspects. But about what remains after the headlines stop. Long after the sirens faded, long after the manhunt ended, Boston was left with something heavier than rubble. Memory. And the question no verdict can ever answer: how do you move forward when the past refuses to stay silent? Boston rebuilt its streets quickly. Barricades came down. The marathon returned. But something invisible stayed behind. Pause. A hesitation. A collective breath the city never quite finished releasing. Tsarnaev was sentenced to death. Then years later that sentence was challenged, reinstated, debated again. For the families of victims, justice didn't feel like a courtroom word. Felt like a chair that stayed empty. A phone that would never ring. A finish line someone never crossed again. No sentence could restore that. Some survivors lost limbs. Others lost time. All lost innocence. Yet many chose to turn pain into purpose. Victim advocacy. Trauma support networks. Public remembrance. Not because they had to, but because silence felt worse. Tragedies don't fade naturally. They fade because people stop talking. Boston refuses to. Every April names are read. Moments of silence are held. Stories are retold, accurately, carefully, responsibly. Because forgetting is the most dangerous outcome of all. The manhunt wasn't just about capture. It was about unity. Neighbors opening doors to strangers. Officers running toward danger. A city choosing solidarity over fear. That's the part often lost in headlines. Years from now, history won't remember every detail of the explosives. We'll remember the people who ran toward the injured. The families who demanded truth. A city that refused to fracture. That's the legacy. Terrorism seeks to be unforgettable. But so does resilience. And in Boston, resilience won. If this story moved you, remember this. Evil only wins when memory fades. And as long as stories like this are told, truthfully, responsibly, and humanely, it never will. Thank you for spending this moment with Coziness Stories. Subscribe, rest easy, and I'll see you in the next story.